The old man sat on his porch, fingers wrapped around a silver pocket watch that had outlived everyone who'd ever touched it. Ethan Mercer was 78 years old, and the leather of his face told stories that words had long since given up trying to tell. Beside him, his grandson Mason stood holding an envelope, the kind that came from lawyers and real estate developers, the kind that promised money and demanded answers. $4.2 million. That's what the paper said. 4.2 million for 640 acres of New Mexico high desert, for a ranch that had survived drought and depression, war and winter for 145 years, a stubborn existence. Mason was 16. The world looked different when you were 16. Everything seemed temporary, replaceable, forgettable. Grandpa, the boy said, we could be rich. Why won't you sell? Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on something Mason couldn't see, yet something that lived in the space between memory and meaning. Out past the cottonwood trees, across the high grass that bent in waves beneath the June wind, there stood a bridge. Wooden stones, simple and strong, spanning Crossing Creek like a promise kept in timber. You see that bridge? Ethan's voice carried the texture of a man who'd learned to choose his words carefully to make each one count. I built that in 1878. Not with money, with blood and a promise. Mason looked at the bridge, then back at his grandfather, then at the envelope in his hands. This is about a story, isn't it? Ethan almost smiled. Almost. It starts with a mistake, he said. Or maybe it was destiny. I've never been quite sure which. His thumb traced the edge of the pocket watch. The metal was warm from his skin, familiar as breathing. When he opened it, the mechanism inside still ticked with the precision of a world that believed in craftsmanship, in things built to last beyond the hands that made them. The sound changed, or maybe Ethan changed. The wind shifted from modern emptiness to something older, wilder, carrying the dust of a different century. It was September, Ethan said, his voice slipping into the past like a man stepping through a door he'd left open for decades. 1878, the last light of a day I thought I understood. San Juan Basin, New Mexico territory. September 1878. Dust rose in red clouds that turned gold in the dying sun. Ethan Mercer stood on the porch of his ranch house, 33 years old, and carrying the kind of solitude that settles into a man's bones when he stops fighting it. His hat turned between calloused hands, around and around, a nervous habit he couldn't quite break. The air tasted of sage and distance. Everything here tasted of distance. Behind him, the ranch house stood simple and square, built from ponderosa pine that still smelled of sap when the sun got hot. 3 rooms, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a bedroom he slept in, alone, a guest room that had stayed empty for 3 years, ever since Sarah and the baby died, in the same hour on a winter night that taught him what loss really meant. His Winchester Model 1873 leaned against the doorframe. 44-40 caliber, 15 rounds, effective range 200 yards. These were the details that mattered out here. Knowing your tools, knowing your limits, knowing when to stand your ground and when to run. He'd expected Clara Bennett, 6 months of letters, careful words exchanged across 1,000 miles. A woman from Kansas with blonde hair and blue eyes, a quiet voice and sentences that never quite said what they meant. She'd written about horse accidents and shoulder scars, about wanting a simple life away from complicated people. He'd written back about land and loneliness, about building something that might outlast him. The carriage came from the east, a Concord stage with wheels caked in New Mexico clay. It stopped in a swirl of settling dust, and for a moment everything went still. Even the wind held its breath. The woman who stepped down was nothing like the letters. Dark hair fell past her shoulders in a thick braid bound with deerskin cord. Her boots hit the ground with the certainty of someone who'd learned to plant her feet on earth that never stayed still for long. She wore a brown cotton dress, practical and plain, and when she looked at Ethan, her eyes held the depth of desert wells, brown and bottomless. 5'6", maybe 130 pounds. A canvas bag slung over her shoulder, worn at the seams. Inside it, he would later learn, she carried an Apache knife with a mesquite handle, a journal bound in leather, and bundles of medicinal herbs wrapped in cloth that smelled of healing and memory. On her right wrist, barely visible beneath the sleeve of her dress, a tattoo. A sun symbol 2 inches across, marked in the traditional way of the Chiricahua Apache. She looked at him the way a person looks at a destination they have been traveling toward, their whole life without quite knowing it. "It's not a mistake," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them with quiet certainty. "I'm yours." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into silence. Ethan forgot how to breathe. The hat in his hands went still. Every single thing he thought he knew about this moment dissolved into the dust and the fading light and the impossible truth standing in front of him. She wasn't Clara Bennett. He knew it instantly. Knew it in the way a man knows winter is coming when the wind changes, knew it bone deep and certain. But she was here, and something in the way she stood, spine straight and eyes unbowed, made him forget about sending her away. "You're not," he managed, voice rougher than he meant it, "Clara Bennett." "No," she said, no apology, no explanation. Just the simple truth offered like a gift she didn't expect him to accept. "But I'm here." 5 seconds of silence. 10. The sun touched the horizon and the shadows grew long enough to reach for tomorrow. Ethan's mind worked through the details. In Clara's letters, she'd described herself. 5'4", blonde hair, blue eyes, a scar on her left shoulder from a horse riding accident when she was 15. This woman was taller, dark-haired, dark-eyed, and that mark on her wrist wasn't a scar. It was identity, culture, belonging. He should have sent her away, should have demanded answers, explanations, the truth behind the deception. Instead, he heard himself say, "Come inside, it's getting cold." The kitchen was 12 feet by 14 with a ceiling of rough-hewn timber, 7 feet high. The stove was a Starlight model 1875 cast iron with 4 burners and an oven that could bake bread or heat the whole room when winter came calling. The table was oak handmade 4 feet by 6 with 2 Windsor chairs that had belonged to his father. On the wall, his guns hung in careful order. The Winchester, a Colt Peacemaker, 45 6 rounds. Sarah's shotgun, a Remington 1874 12-gauge with a double barrel and buckshot that could stop a man at 30 yards. He lit the oil lamp. Coleman brand burned kerosene gave light for 8 hours if you didn't turn the wick too high. The woman set her bag down gently, as if unsure she'd be allowed to keep it there. She stood in the doorway between outside and in between, leaving and staying, and waited for him to decide which way the door would swing. Ethan filled the kettle from the barrel by the stove. Water hauled from Crossing Creek, clear and cold. He set it on the burner and struck a match, watched the flame catch and spread beneath the iron. The silence stretched like leather and the sun tight and patient. "Where's Clara?" he asked. "Safe, California." "Why brought her father?" "And you're here because—" "She asked me. I had nowhere else." The kettle began to hiss. Steam rose in thin wisps, visible in the lamplight. Ethan poured coffee into 2 tin cups, strong and black. Arbuckles, brand the kind that came in burlap sacks with the beans already roasted. He'd ground it that morning before dawn, before he knew his whole life was about to change. He set 1 cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, but didn't drink, just held the warmth like something precious. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naira. Naira Redhawk. Apache. Chiricahua." She said it without shame or apology, just fact. Ethan nodded slowly. He pulled Clara's last letter from the drawer in the table, unfolded. It read the words again, even though he'd memorized them weeks ago. "I have a scar on my left shoulder from a horse riding accident when I was 15. It's about 4 inches long. I'm 5'4" with blonde hair and blue eyes." He looked at Naira. No scar on her shoulder, a sun tattoo on her wrist. Taller than 5'4", hair black as midnight, eyes brown as the earth itself. He'd known the moment he saw her. The question wasn't whether she was Clara. The question mattered. "You know I know," he said quietly. Her hands tightened on the cup. "Yes." "Why didn't Clara come?" Naira's eyes dropped to the coffee, to the steam rising between them, like a thin veil of truth trying to hide what couldn't be hidden. "Because the man who calls himself her father would have found her, would have dragged her back, would have finished what he started." Something in her voice made Ethan's chest go tight. He'd heard that tone before in the voices of men who'd seen war, in the words of women who'd survived things that should have killed them. "Started what?" She looked up then, and in her eyes he saw the mirror of his own loneliness, the kind that comes from losing everything and learning to carry the empty space where everything used to be. Destroying her, slowly, for years. The coffee went cold while she told him. About Clara Bennett, 22 years old, daughter of a rich man in Kansas who believed people were property and daughters were possessions. About bruises hidden under long sleeves and fear disguised as obedience. About a father who'd lost his wife and decided his daughter would replace her in every way except name. About meeting Clara 6 weeks ago in Santa Fe at a boarding house called Carson's, where Naira washed dishes for $2 a week and tried not to think about all the places she'd run from and all the places that wouldn't let her stay. She was crying, Naira said, in her room. I brought her food and she looked at me like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to see her. And she asked you to take her place. No, she asked me to disappear with her, to California, to somewhere far enough that her father's money and connections couldn't reach. But I couldn't go. Why not? Because she had a name, a lineage, papers that said she belonged somewhere. I don't, I'm Apache. We don't belong anywhere anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the night that had fallen while they talked. Stars scattered across the sky, like seeds thrown by a generous hand, growing light instead of crops. So you came here in her place. I came here because she said you were kind, that your letters talked about building something, not owning someone. She said maybe a man like that wouldn't turn away a woman like me. And if I did, then I'd keep moving, like I've been doing for 5 years. Ethan turned back to face her. She sat at his table holding an empty coffee cup, looking at him with eyes that had stopped expecting kindness, but hadn't quite given up hoping for it. In his mind, a voice that sounded like his father's spoke words he'd heard 100 times growing up. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns. It's measured by what he does when nobody's watching. Nobody was watching now. Just the stars and the silence, and the weight of a decision that felt bigger than one night. One woman, one moment of choosing between what was expected and what was right. You can stay, he said, in the guest room, as long as you need. Relief flickered across her face there and gone like lightning in summer clouds. I'll work for my keep. I can cook, clean 10 animals. My grandmother taught me medicine. I know plants healing. You don't owe me anything. Everyone owes something. Not here, not in my house. She stood up, then gathered her cup, moved toward the wash basin like she'd been doing it her whole life. Her movements had the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste motion, not to take up more space than absolutely necessary. The room's through there, Ethan said, pointing to the door on the left. It's small, but it's warm. She nodded, picked up her canvas bag, paused at the threshold. Why, she asked. Why didn't you send me away? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, lonely and certain. Because I've been alone for 3 years, he said. And in your eyes, I see the same thing I see in the mirror every morning. Someone who's forgotten what home feels like. She didn't say anything, just held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, then disappeared into the guest room and closed the door with a softness that felt like gratitude. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a long time after she left. He picked up Clara's letter, read it again, then folded it carefully and put it back in the drawer. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, maybe danger. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a place where something might grow if he was brave enough to let it. He walked to the door of the guest room. Inside, he could hear her moving quietly, unpacking the small life she carried in that canvas bag. The room had been his daughter's for the single hour she'd lived. He and Sarah had painted it pale blue, hung a small wooden cradle in the corner. The cradle was still there. Naira would see it, would understand what this room meant, what it cost him to offer it. I lost everyone too, she'd said earlier, 5 years ago. 2 broken people standing in the ruins of other people's lives. Maybe that was enough to build something new. Or maybe it would all fall apart by morning. Either way, he'd made his choice. Sleep came slowly. When it did, Ethan dreamed of bridges and rivers of hands reaching across water too wide to cross alone. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and the sound of someone who knew their way around a kitchen. Ethan woke at 4:30, the habit of a rancher's life too deeply ingrained to break. He dressed in the dark, pulled on his boots, walked out into the main room expecting emptiness. Instead, he found Naira at the stove fire, already lit, coffee already brewing. She'd found the bread flour, made biscuits, set them to bake in the oven. The table was swept clean, The floor looked like it had been mopped, and everything smelled of smoke and sustenance. She turned when she heard him, her hair already braided, her movements calm and certain. "Good morning," she said. "You didn't have to do all this. Hands that don't work, don't eat. My grandmother's rule." "Your grandmother sounds like a practical woman." "She was the most practical woman in our tribe, and the kindest. Those two things are not opposites no matter what people think." Ethan poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter, watched her work. She moved through the space like water, finding the path of least resistance, efficient and graceful. "You want to see the land?" he asked. "Before you decide if you're staying." She looked at him, then surprise flickering in her dark eyes. "I thought you already decided that." "I decided you could stay. You need to decide if you want to." She considered this, her hands going still on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir something in the pot. "Show me," she said. "Show me what you're building here." They walked the land as the sun climbed higher, turning the high desert from gray to gold. 640 acres, a full square mile, granted under the Homestead Act of 1862. 5 years of living on it, working it, proving to the government that he could turn wild land into something productive. 400 acres of grassland where his 50 head of longhorn cattle grazed. 200 acres of hillside covered in pinyon pine and juniper. 40 acres of bottomland along Crossing Creek, rich soil that flooded in spring and grew cottonwoods 100 years old. Naira walked beside him in silence for the first mile, her eyes taking in everything with the attention of someone who'd learned to read landscapes the way other people read books. "Coyotes," she said, pointing to tracks in the soft earth near the creek. "3 of them. Last night." Ethan stopped, looked at the tracks he'd walked right past without seeing. "How do you know how many?" She knelt down, fingers hovering over the prints without touching them, reading the story written in dust and pressure. "This one is deeper, the leader heavier. These two overlap following. The freshest print is here." She touched the damp earth near the water. "Still wet, maybe 3 hours old. Your uncle taught you." "My uncle was a scout, before the relocation, before everything changed." She stood up, brushed the dust from her hands, kept walking. They came to a field where Ethan had tried to grow corn, tried and failed, the stalks thin and yellow, struggling in soil that didn't seem to want them. Naira stopped, looked at the dying plants, then at the ground around them. "You're planting wrong," she said. "I'm planting how my father taught me. Your father didn't live in the desert. You need the 3 sisters." "3 what?" "Corn, beans, squash, together. The corn gives the beans something to climb. The beans put nitrogen back in the soil. The squash leaves shade the ground, keep moisture in, keep weeds out. It's how my people have farmed for 1,000 years." Ethan looked at his failed crop, then at this woman who'd appeared in his life less than 12 hours ago and was already teaching him things his father never knew. "Who taught you this?" "My grandmother. She could grow food in places where nothing should grow. She said the land talks to you if you're quiet enough to listen." They walked on, past the barn where his horses stamped and whickered, past the cattle pens built from juniper logs, past the well he'd dug himself 40 feet down to water that tasted of minerals and persistence. And then they came to Crossing Creek and the old wooden bridge. 6 planks of pine 20 feet long and 12 inches wide laid across 2 support beams, sunk into stone foundations on either bank. Rope railings frayed and fading. One plank in the middle dipped lower than the others, the wood starting to rot from 5 years of spring floods. Below the creek ran brown and fast swollen from recent rains up in the mountains. The sound of water rushing over stone filled the air, constant and hungry. Naira stopped 10 feet from the bridge. Her face went pale. Her breathing changed shallow and quick. Ethan noticed immediately. "You don't have to cross," he said. "No." Her voice was tight. "I do. I can't keep running from water." She took 1 step forward, then another. Her hand reached for the rope railing, gripped it so hard her knuckles went white. "Watch where I step," Ethan said, testing each plank with his weight before committing to it. The wood groaned but held. Naira followed. 3 planks. 4. The water churned below loud as thunder closes breath. The 5th plank cracked. Not broke, not yet. But the sound split the air like a gunshot, and the whole bridge shifted, tilting left, and Naira's boot slipped on the wet wood. She grabbed for the rope, Her fingers closed on frayed hemp. The rope slid through her grip. Ethan moved without thinking. 3 steps back, across groaning timber, his hand closing around her arm just as her knee buckled, and the bridge swayed like a drunk man trying to dance. "Don't look down," he said, his voice close to her ear, steady despite the fear in his chest. "Look at me. Just me." Her eyes found his. Brown meeting brown. Fear meeting certainty. "You're not alone up here. I've got you." They moved together, inch by inch, Ethan's hand on her arm, his weight counterbalancing hers, his breath matching hers, until they found the same rhythm and crossed the last 10 feet as one. When they reached solid ground, Naira's legs gave out. She sat hard in the grass, her whole body shaking like leaves in wind. Ethan knelt beside her, his hand still on her arm, waiting until the trembling eased. "You saved me," she whispered. "You weren't falling. You just needed someone steady." "No." She looked at him with eyes that held more than this moment, more than this bridge. "You saved me. You could have let me fall. Most people would have." "I'm not most people." "I'm starting to see that." They sat by the creek for a while, letting the sun warm their skin and the sound of water remind them that some things just keep flowing no matter what tries to stop them. "You want to tell me about it?" Ethan asked. "About the water." Naira pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, became small in a way that made her look younger and older at the same time. 1873, she said. "The Army relocated our tribe from Arizona to Oklahoma. 110 people. We walked 600 miles. Her voice was quiet, factual, the tone of someone reciting a history that had happened to someone else, even though Ethan knew it hadn't. At the Rio Grande, it was flood season. The commanding officer said we had to cross immediately. No waiting. He said we were costing the government too much money to feed." She paused, breathed, continued. "My mother carried my baby brother, 3 years old. I held her hand. The water was strong, she slipped. I held on as hard as I could, but I wasn't strong enough." "How many?" Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. 23, gone in minutes, including my mother, my brother, my aunt, the elders who knew all the old songs. Silence, just the creek and the wind and the sound of grief too big for words. "I was the translator," Naira said. "I spoke English and Apache and Spanish. I talked to the soldiers. I told them we were innocent of the raid they accused us of. I begged them to check to verify. They didn't believe me. So in my tribe's eyes, I failed them. I couldn't save them with my words." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. What could he say? Sorry seemed too small. Everything seemed too small. "You survived," he finally said. "That's not failure, that's strength. You don't understand Apache culture. I was supposed to. I understand loss. I understand carrying guilt for things you couldn't control. My wife died because I couldn't get the doctor fast enough. I watched our daughter take one breath and stop. And I've lived 3 years believing I failed them." His voice cracked on the last word. He hadn't meant to say all that, hadn't meant to share the weight he'd been carrying alone. "But maybe," he continued, "we didn't fail. Maybe we're just two people who survived when others didn't. And maybe we get to choose what that means." Naira looked at him, really looked, and something shifted in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The kind that happens when two broken pieces fit together and realize they might be able to make something whole. The sound of hoof beats interrupted the moment. Fast hoof beats, urgent. Ethan stood, his hand automatically going to his hip, where his Colt should be, and wasn't because he'd left it in the house. Through the cottonwoods came a rider on a gray mare moving fast enough to raise dust. An older man, 50-ish, white beard, sharp eyes. Samuel Whitfield, Ethan's neighbor and the closest thing he had to a friend. "Ethan," Sam called as he pulled his horse to a stop. "You got company coming and—" "Oh." He'd seen Naira stop mid-sentence, his eyes going from her to Ethan and back again. "You're not Clara Bennett," Sam said. "No," Ethan replied. "Long story." Sam dismounted, took off his hat, looked at Naira with curiosity but not judgment. "Ma'am, Sam Whitfield, blacksmith, retired soldier, and apparently the bearer of bad news today." "What news?" Ethan asked. Sam pulled a telegram from his vest pocket, handed it over. The paper was thin, the words stamped in black ink. "Seeking mail order bride, Clara Bennett. Stop last destination. Mercer Ranch, New Mexico. Stop $500 reward. Stop Edwin Bennett. Naira stood up slowly, her face going pale again, but for different reasons. I have to leave, she said. No, Ethan said. You'll get in trouble because of me. I'm used to trouble. You don't understand. Edwin Bennett is Clara's father. I know. Sam told me about him when he signed me up for the bride agency in the first place. Sam nodded. Edwin Bennett owns half of Kansas. Rich, connected, and mean as a snake with a toothache. If he's looking for Clara, he's not going to stop until he finds her. Then we make sure he doesn't, Ethan said. How? Naira asked. He'll come here. He'll have proof I was with Clara. He'll have me arrested. Not if you're my wife. The words fell into the space between them like stones into deep water. Sam's eyebrows went up. Naira's breath caught. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. What did you just say? Naira whispered. Marry me, legal and proper. A man can't make claims on another man's wife, especially not in New Mexico territory. Ethan, you barely know me. I know enough. I know you're running from something that would break most people. I know you're brave enough to cross a bridge, even though water terrifies you. I know you can track coyotes and grow crops and make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. That's not love. No, but it's something. And maybe something is enough. Sam cleared his throat. Hate to interrupt, but if you're going to do this, you better do it fast. That telegram means Bennett is already on his way. You got maybe 48 hours before he shows up with lawyers and guns and enough money to make problems for everyone. Ethan looked at Naira. She looked back, her eyes searching his face for something he hoped she'd find. I won't force you, he said, but I am offering a real marriage, or as real as we can make it. Protection, a home, a chance to stop running. Why would you risk everything for someone you just met? Because 3 years ago I stood by a grave and swore I'd never let myself care about anyone again. But you walked off that carriage and said it wasn't a mistake, and for the first time since Sarah died, I believed that maybe it wasn't. Maybe none of it was. Maybe all of it, every loss and scar and mile walked alone, was leading here, to this choice, to you. The silence stretched. A hawk called overhead. The creek kept flowing. All right, Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper. All right, I'll marry you. Sam grinned. Well, damn, I'll go get Reverend Hayes from San Luis. He owes me a favor anyway. We can do this at dawn. Have you legally wed before Bennett's shadow even falls on New Mexico soil. He swung back onto his horse, tipped his hat to both of them. Congratulations, he said. I think. Hell, I don't know anymore. But whatever this is, it's going to be interesting. He rode off in a cloud of dust and certainty, leaving Ethan and Naira standing by the creek, newly engaged to be married in less than 12 hours for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. You sure about this? Naira asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's either very brave or very stupid. With me, it's usually both. She almost smiled. Almost. They walked back to the ranch house in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of strangers, the silence of two people who just made a promise they weren't sure they could keep, but were going to try anyway. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, and ahead the ranch house waited, and between them something fragile and terrifying began to grow. Something that looked a lot like hope. 4:30 in the morning. The air carried that particular cold that only comes in desert country, the kind that settles into your bones and reminds you that life out here is a daily negotiation with forces bigger than yourself. Sam Whitfield had ridden through the night to San Luis, a town 40 miles south, where Reverend Thomas Hayes lived in a small adobe house behind a church that had stood since the Spanish came through 200 years ago. Hayes was 65 years old, thin as winter grass, with eyes that had seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by any of it. He'd agreed to come without asking too many questions. Sam had that effect on people. When a man who'd fought in the Civil War and survived 3 arrow wounds asked you for a favor at 2 in the morning, you generally said yes. Naira hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in the small guest room, sitting by the window, watching stars wheel overhead, like they were trying to tell her something in a language she'd forgotten how to read. The room still held traces of its original purpose. The cradle in the corner, a small rocking chair, the faint smell of baby powder that had somehow survived 3 years of emptiness. She understood what it meant that Ethan had given her this room, understood the weight of the gift, the size of the trust. Her hands had busied themselves with the only dress she owned that wasn't brown or gray. Dark blue cotton, simple and plain, bought secondhand in Santa Fe with money she'd earned washing dishes. She'd mended it by lamplight, fixed a tear in the hem, sewn a loose button with thread she'd found in a drawer. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it was clean, and sometimes clean was the best you could do. Ethan had stayed up too in the main room, sitting at the table with his father's pocket watch open in front of him. Inside, a daguerreotype photograph showed two people who'd been young once. His mother and father taken in 1851, the year they'd married. The year they'd started building something that would outlast them. He'd shaved for the first time in weeks, cut his hair with the scissors Sam had left behind, put on the only suit he owned, brown wool that had belonged to his father, altered to fit his slightly broader shoulders. The vest was black, the cravat was white. He looked like a man going to court or a funeral, not a wedding. Maybe they were all the same thing in the end. All of them just promises made in front of witnesses, hoping the words would be enough to hold back whatever came next. When the first gray light touched the eastern sky, they gathered by Crossing Creek, not on the bridge. Naira couldn't face that yet. 50 feet upstream, under a cottonwood tree that had been growing when Spanish conquistadors first mapped these territories. Reverend Hayes stood with his back to the water, a worn Bible in his hands. The book had been printed in 1869, the year Hayes took his vows and promised to serve God in whatever forgotten corners of the world needed serving. Sam stood to one side, witness and friend, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt Navy 1851, the gun he'd carried through Gettysburg and Antietam, and a dozen smaller battles whose names history had already started to forget. Ethan stood facing Naira, his hands empty, his heart somewhere between his throat and his boots. She stood facing him, her hair braided in a style Sam's late wife used to wear, Mexican and Apache, both two cultures woven together in leather cord. Hayes cleared his throat. His voice carried the texture of a man who'd said these words 100 times in 100 different circumstances and meant them every single time. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The creek flowed, the cottonwood leaves rustled. Somewhere in the distance, a dove called to its mate. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted. Hayes looked at Ethan, then at Naira, his eyes asking a question, his voice didn't. They both nodded. Ethan Mercer, do you take Naira Redhawk to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Ethan's voice came out steady, stronger than he felt inside. I do. Naira Redhawk, do you take Ethan Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Naira's voice trembled slightly, but the words came clear. I do. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out his father's pocket watch. Silver, heavy, worth more in memory than money. I don't have a ring, he said quietly, but this is the most valuable thing I own. My father gave it to me before he died, told me to pass it on when I found something worth keeping. He opened the watch, showed her the photograph inside. Two people, young and hopeful, standing together against a painted backdrop of somewhere that looked nothing like where they actually lived. Now it belongs to both of us, Ethan said. Naira took the watch in both hands, her fingers tracing the engraved surface, the worn places where 3 generations of thumbs had rubbed the same spot smooth. I don't have anything to give you, she whispered. You already gave me something. You said yes. Hayes smiled, then a small, private smile that said he'd seen enough loveless marriages to recognize when something real was happening, even if the people involved didn't quite know it yet. By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, and the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. He paused. You may kiss your bride. Ethan stepped forward. Naira tilted her face up. Their lips met in a kiss that lasted maybe 3 seconds, careful and respectful, the kiss of two people who'd made a promise they weren't sure how to keep, but were going to trim. When they pulled apart, Sam was grinning and clapping and making enough noise for a whole congregation. About damn time somebody got married around here, he said. Reverend, you want some coffee before the long ride back? I'd be obliged, Hayes said. They started walking back toward the ranch house, the four of them, two married and two witnesses, when the sound of horses stopped them cold. Multiple horses, moving fast, coming from the east. Sam's hand went to his gun. Ethan stepped in front of Naira without thinking about it. Hayes gripped his Bible like it might turn into a shield if he believed hard enough. 5 riders came over the rise, silhouetted against the growing dawn. They rode expensive horses with expensive saddles, and they moved with the confidence of men who'd never been told no and didn't plan to start now. The lead rider was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, silver-haired. Even from a distance, everything about him screamed money and power and the kind of certainty that comes from never having to answer to anyone. Edwin Bennett. He rode right up to where they stood, his 4 hired men fanning out on either side. Professional gunmen, Ethan saw. You could tell by the way they sat their horses, by the way their eyes constantly moved, cataloging threats and exits and lines of fire. Bennett dismounted with practiced ease. His boots hit the ground, and he straightened, pulling off his leather riding gloves, one finger at a time, a gesture designed to make everyone wait while he completed it. He was 50 years old and looked like a man who'd spent those years getting exactly what he wanted. Silver hair combed back from a high forehead, a thick mustache in the military style, blue eyes that looked through people instead of at them. His suit probably cost $50, 2 months' wages for a working man. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. The Colt Peacemaker at his hip had a gold-plated handle more for show than use. Ethan Mercer, I presume, Bennett said. His voice carried the accent of educated Kansas layered over something harder underneath. That's right, Ethan said. I'm looking for my daughter, Clara Bennett. I was informed she was to be delivered here as a mail-order bride. She's not here. Bennett's eyes moved past Ethan to Naira, and something cold slithered across his face. Then who is this, my wife? The words hung in the air. Bennett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your wife, how convenient. He looked at Hayes at the Bible still in the Reverend's hands. Fresh married are you, he? This morning, Hayes said. Legal and proper. I have the certificate right here. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Bennett took it, read it, his eyes moving across the words with the speed of someone who'd read a lot of legal documents in his time. Ethan Mercer and Naira Redhawk, he read aloud. Witnessed by Samuel Whitfield and Thomas Hayes. Married this day, September 15th, 1878. He handed the paper back. Very efficient. You were expecting Clara Bennett yesterday, and this morning you're married to someone else. Someone who's not even white. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. My wife's heritage is none of your concern. Oh, but it is my concern. You see, I have witnesses who saw this woman with my daughter in Santa Fe. And now my daughter is missing, and this woman is conveniently married to the man who was supposed to receive Clara. He stepped closer to Naira, and Ethan moved to block him. Don't, Ethan said quietly. Bennett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Where is my daughter? I don't know, Naira said, her voice steady despite the fear Ethan could feel radiating from her. She didn't come here. Liar, you were seen with her, talking to her, planning something. I spoke to her. That's not a crime. Kidnapping is. Sam stepped forward now, his hand very deliberately resting on his gun. Nobody kidnapped anybody. And you're on private property making accusations without proof. I suggest you leave before this gets unpleasant. Bennett looked at Sam, sized him up, dismissed him. I'll leave, but I'll be back with the sheriff and evidence. And when I prove that this woman aided in the abduction of my daughter, she'll hang for it. He turned to his men. Let's go. We have business in town. He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, looked down at Ethan and Naira. 48 hours. Enjoy your marriage while it lasts. Then he was gone, riding back the way he'd come, his hired guns following like shadows. The silence they left behind felt heavy enough to crush stone. Well, Sam said eventually, that went about as well as expected. He's going to try to annul the marriage, Hayes said. Claim it was fraudulent, that you married her to hide a crime. Can he do that? Naira asked. He can try, Hayes said. Whether he succeeds depends on Judge Williams. And Judge Williams is a hard man to predict. He follows the law to the letter, but he's also fair. If you can prove the marriage is legitimate, if you can show Clara left of her own free will. We need a lawyer, Sam said. We need money for a lawyer, Ethan corrected. He looked at Naira, at this woman who was now legally his wife, who'd been in his life less than 24 hours, who he just promised to protect for better or worse. Come on, he said. We need to talk about what we're going to do. They walked back to the ranch house, the four of them, and sat around the kitchen table while the sun finished rising, and the enormity of what they'd gotten into settled around them like dust after an explosion. Hiram Goldman, Sam said, best lawyer in Santa Fe. Jewish fellow sharp as a razor, doesn't scare easy. How much, Ethan asked. $200 retainer, 50 a day for trial work, plus expenses. Ethan stood up, walked to his bedroom, came back with a small iron strongbox. He opened it on the table. Inside, $47 in paper money and silver coins, his entire savings from 3 years of ranching. Also inside the deed to his land, 640 acres worth, maybe $1,000 if you could find a buyer. But land didn't sell fast out here. You needed cash. I've got 50 head of cattle, Ethan said, worth about $10 each. That's 500, but I'd have to sell the whole herd, and that would leave me with no income. What about the land? Sam asked. Can't sell it fast enough. Bennett will be back with the law before I can find a buyer. Sam was quiet for a moment, thinking. The North Pasture, he said finally. 200 acres. Best grazing land you've got. George Patterson's been wanting to buy it for years. Ethan's chest went tight. The North Pasture, the piece of land where he'd planned to build a bigger house someday, where he and Sarah used to walk in the evenings planning a future that never came. That's 40% of my best land, he said. I know, but Patterson has cash. He'd buy today if you asked. Naira stood up her chair, scraping loud against the floor. No, don't sell your land for me. I'll leave. I'll go somewhere Bennett can't find me. Where? Ethan asked. Where can you go that he won't follow? He has money connections, hired men. You'd be running the rest of your life. Better than destroying yours. Ethan looked at her, at this woman who'd walked into his life carrying nothing but a canvas bag and more courage than most men he'd known. Land is just dirt, he said. You're a person. There's no comparison. But your ranch will survive. I'll make it survive. But I need you to trust me on this. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have been enough, because she sat back down. All right, she said quietly. All right. 2 hours later, Ethan rode into Stillwater. The town squatted in a valley between red rock mesas, 200 souls, trying to make civilization stick in a place that had other ideas. Main Street ran north to south, lined with false front buildings that looked bigger than they were. Peterson's General Store, Murphy's Saloon, the land office, the sheriff's office with its small jail attached, and Patterson Ranch Supply, owned by George Patterson, the second richest man in the county after Bennett himself. Patterson was 55, heavy-set, with a handlebar mustache and shrewd eyes that never missed a detail. He'd been ranching for 30 years and owned 1,200 acres of prime land. He'd made offers on Ethan's North Pasture before, always turned down, always politely. Ethan tied his horse outside the supply store and walked in. Patterson looked up from his ledger, surprise flickering across his face. Ethan, don't usually see you in town middle of the week. Something wrong? I need to sell some land, fast. Patterson's expression shifted from surprise to interest. What land? North Pasture, 200 acres. Mr. Patterson set down his pen carefully. What's the price? 300. That's high. I'd go 200. There's a spring on it. Year-round water, worth 400 easy. In a normal sale, maybe, but you said fast. And fast means you need cash, which means I got leverage. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was how it worked. Everyone knew it. Desperate sellers got desperate prices. 250, he said. 220, final offer. Ethan thought about Naira, about Bennett, about 48 hours and running out of time. Deal. Patterson pulled out a cash box from under the counter, counted out $220 in a mix of paper notes and silver coins. Then he produced a bill of sale already prepared, like he'd been expecting this conversation for years. Ethan signed it. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name, transferring ownership of the land where he'd planned to build his future to a man who just saw it as an investment. Pleasure doing business, Patterson said. Ethan didn't answer, just took the money and walked out. Outside, he stood in the street for a moment, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. That land had been part of his dream, part of what he and Sarah had imagined together. And he'd just sold it in 5 minutes to buy a chance at protecting someone he barely knew. But when he thought about Naira, about the way she crossed that bridge, even though it terrified her, about the quiet strength in her voice when she'd said her vows, the regret faded a little. Some things were worth more than land. He rode back to the ranch, gave Naira and Sam the money. "It's enough," Sam said. "Barely, but enough." "Then we go to Santa Fe," Ethan said. "Today." The ride to Santa Fe took a full day, 40 miles of high desert country following old trails that the Spanish had carved out centuries before. They stopped once at a way station, paid $2 for a room with a straw mattress and walls thin enough to hear every sound from the other rooms. Ethan gave Naira the bed. He slept on the floor, his back against the door, the Winchester across his lap. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that the silence didn't already cover. In the morning, they rode the last 15 miles into Santa Fe. The town sprawled across a high plateau, 4,000 souls, and changed the oldest capital city in what would someday be the United States. The plaza at the center dated back to 1610, surrounded by adobe buildings that looked like they'd grown out of the earth rather than being built on it. The streets smelled of roasting chilies and horse manure and possibility. Wagons crowded the main thoroughfares, loaded with everything from furniture to firearms. Women in long dresses walked beside men in cowboy hats and boots. Spanish mixed with English, mixed with half a dozen native languages. Hiram Goldman's office was on San Francisco Street in a 2-story adobe building with wooden shutters painted blue. A sign hung above the door, "Hiram Goldman, Attorney at Law." They tied their horses and went inside. The office was small but orderly, shelves lined with law books, a desk covered in papers organized into neat stacks. Behind the desk sat a man in his late 40s, slightly overweight, wearing a black suit and a red tie. He had a thick beard and wire-rimmed spectacles that magnified his sharp eyes. He looked up when they entered, took in Ethan's dusty clothes and Naira's nervous posture, and set down his pen. "Mr. Mercer, I presume. Sam Whitfield sent word you'd be coming." His voice carried the rapid-fire cadence of someone from back east, probably New York. Every word precisely pronounced, no wasted syllables. "That's right," Ethan said. "And this is Mrs. Mercer." "Yes." Goldman stood, came around the desk, shook both their hands with a firm grip. "Sit. Tell me everything. Leave nothing out. I can't defend what I don't know." So they told him, starting with the letters from Clara moving through Naira's arrival, the hasty wedding minutes, threats. Goldman took notes in quick shorthand, his pen scratching across paper like a weapon being sharpened. When they finished, he sat back, tapped his pen against his teeth, thinking. "This is difficult," he said finally. "Not impossible, but difficult." "Can Bennett annul the marriage?" Naira asked. "He can try. The argument would be fraud. That you married to conceal a crime, namely kidnapping his daughter. If he can prove that in court, Judge Williams might void the marriage and order your arrest." "But I didn't kidnap her." "I believe you. The question is, will Judge Williams believe you? Without Clara here to testify, without proof that she left voluntarily, it's your word against Edwin Bennett's money and influence." "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. Goldman leaned forward, his eyes intense behind his spectacles. "We need 3 things. First, proof the marriage is legitimate. That's easy. We have the certificate, the witness is the reverend. Second, we need evidence that Bennett is violent, that Clara had reason to run. That's harder, but possible. Third, and most important, we need Clara herself, or at least a letter, a telegram, something proving she's alive and safe." "She's in California," Naira said. "San Francisco. But she didn't give me an address. She was afraid Bennett would track any communication." "Then we find her, or we find people who saw Bennett hurt Clara, witnesses, medical records if they exist. Anything that shows he's not the concerned father he's pretending to be." "How much time do we have?" Ethan asked. "Bennett filed his petition this morning. Judge Williams set a hearing for 5 days from now. We have until then to build a case. And your fee, 200 retainer, 50 per day for trial work, plus any expenses for witnesses, telegrams, travel." Ethan pulled out the money from the land sale, counted out $220, everything he had. "This is all of it," he said, "every cent." Goldman looked at the money, then at Ethan's face, then at Naira. "You sold something to get this." "My best land." Goldman was quiet for a moment. Then he counted out $200, pushed the remaining 20 back across the desk. Keep it. For food. For the ride back. I'll take the 200 and make it work. Why? Ethan asked. Because I've defended a lot of men in my career. Rich men who could afford me. And you know what I learned? Money doesn't make you right. It just makes you loud. He looked at Bennett through the window as if he could see him somewhere out there in the city. Edwin Bennett is very loud. I'd like to see him lose for once. He stood up, shook their hands again. Go back to your ranch. Find anyone who might have seen Bennett with Clara. Any servants, any neighbors, anyone. Send them to me. And pray that Clara is smart enough to reach out before the hearing. They left the office as the sun started its slow descent toward evening. Santa Fe glowed golden in the late light, beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its streets. You think we can win? Naira asked as they walked back to their horses. I think we have to try, Ethan said. They rode out of Santa Fe as darkness fell, heading back toward a ranch that suddenly felt smaller and more precious, back toward a life that hung in the balance of a courtroom and a judge's decision. Behind them, the city lights flickered on one by one. Ahead, the desert stretched, dark and endless, full of dangers seen and unseen. They made it back to the ranch after midnight. Sam was waiting on the porch, his rifle across his knees, a lantern burning beside him. Any trouble? He asked. Not yet, Ethan said, but it's coming. Inside, they ate cold beans and bread, too tired to cook anything more elaborate. Naira's hands shook as she held her tin plate, exhaustion and fear finally catching up with her. Get some sleep, Ethan told her. Tomorrow we start looking for witnesses. She nodded, too tired to argue, and disappeared into the guest room. Sam and Ethan sat at the table in the lamplight. You really sold the North Pasture, Sam said. It wasn't a question. Had to. That was your best land. I know. Sarah loved that land. I know that too. Sam was quiet for a long moment. You love this woman, Naira? Ethan looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars from 3 years of working alone. I don't know. But I know I couldn't watch her hang for helping someone escape a bad situation. And I know that when she's in the room, the house doesn't feel empty anymore. That's not love. Maybe not, but it's something. Sam nodded slowly, accepting this. What do you need me to do? Ride to Stillwater tomorrow. Ask around. See if anyone remembers Clara coming through with her father. See if anyone noticed anything wrong. I can do that. They sat in silence for a while longer, two men who'd both lost wives, both knew grief, both understood that sometimes you had to make impossible choices and hope they didn't destroy you. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming rain. The next 3 days passed in a blur of desperate searching. Sam rode to Stillwater, talked to everyone who would listen. He found Mrs. Patterson at the general store, a woman in her 50s who'd survived 20 years of marriage to a man who drank too much and hit too hard. I remember Clara Bennett, she told Sam quietly when no one else was in earshot. Came through 8 months ago with her father. Beautiful girl. Scared eyes. You see anything specific? Sam asked. Bruises on her wrists. When I asked about them, she said she'd fallen off a horse. But I've fallen off horses. Those weren't horse bruises. Those were hand bruises from someone grabbing too hard. Would you testify to that? Mrs. Patterson looked scared. Edwin Bennett is a powerful man. So is the truth. She thought about it for a long time. Yes, she finally said. Yes, I'll testify. Meanwhile, Ethan sent a telegram to San Francisco addressed to general delivery, hoping against hope that Clara would check for messages. Clara Bennett, stop, need you testify. Stop, father suing. Stop, please respond. Stop. Ethan Mercer. The cost was $2.50, money they couldn't afford to spend. No response came. Naira spent the days teaching Ethan the three sisters' method of farming, planting corn and beans and squash in the field where his crops had failed. Working helped keep the fear at bay, kept her hands busy, and her mind focused on something she could control. But at night, lying in the small guest room, she could hear Ethan in the next room pacing, unable to sleep, the weight of what he'd sacrificed pressing down on him. On the fourth day, Sheriff Marcus Dalton came to the ranch. He rode up alone mid-morning, his badge catching the sunlight. 45 years old, tall and lean, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. He wore a brown vest over a white shirt, a Colt .45 at his hip, and an expression that said he didn't want to be here. Ethan met him on the porch, Winchester in hand, but pointed at the ground. "Sheriff, Ethan, I need to talk to you, both of you." Naira came to the door, stood beside Ethan. Dalton took off his hat, held it in both hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I have to do my job." "Which is?" Edwin Bennett filed a formal complaint, alleges that Mrs. Mercer aided in the kidnapping of his daughter. Judge Williams issued an order. I have to serve it. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, handed it over. Ethan read it, his jaw tightening with each line. "This says Naira has to appear in court in 2 days to show cause why she shouldn't be arrested for kidnapping." "That's right. And if she doesn't appear, then I have to arrest her now." Naira's hand found Ethan's, squeezed it. "I'll appear," she said. "I'm not running." Dalton looked relieved. "Good. That's good." He paused. "For what it's worth, I don't think you kidnapped anyone, but Bennett has lawyers and money, and he's making a lot of noise. Judge Williams has to take it serious." "What about justice?" Ethan asked. "Justice and law aren't always the same thing. You know that." He put his hat back on, prepared to mount his horse. "Ethan, bit of advice, off the record. Find Clara Bennett, or find proof she's safe. Without that, this is going to go bad for you." He rode away, leaving them standing on the porch with a court summons and 48 hours before everything they'd built in the last week fell apart. That night, Ethan and Naira sat at the kitchen table, the lantern burning low between them. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is all my fault." "No, Bennett is at fault. Clara's father is at fault. You're just someone trying to help. But you lost your land, your money, and now we fight. That's all we can do." She looked at him across the table, this man who'd taken her in, married her, protected her, all in the space of a week. This stranger who felt less like a stranger every day. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood table. "3 years ago," he said finally, "I stood by 2 graves and swore I'd never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again. I was going to live alone, die alone, and call that strength." He looked up, met her eyes. "But you walked off that carriage and said it wasn't a mistake. And something in me that had been dead for 3 years woke up. Maybe it's not love. Not yet. But it's something alive. And I'd rather lose everything fighting for something alive than keep everything while staying dead inside." Naira's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "How to let someone care. How to stay when staying has only ever led to loss." "Neither do I, but we can figure it out together." She stood up, came around the table, and for the first time since they'd met, she initiated touch. Her arms went around him, her head rested on his shoulder, and they stood there in the lamplight, 2 broken people holding each other up. Tomorrow would bring the courtroom and the judge and Edwin Bennett's accusations. But tonight they had this. Each other. And sometimes that was enough to make you believe you might survive what came next. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. And in the distance, too far to hear, but close enough to feel a storm was building. The Stillwater courthouse stood like a promise that law might still mean something in a territory where justice often came at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun. The building was single-story adobe, 30 feet by 40, with walls thick enough to keep out both summer heat and winter cold. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, carved from solid oak and raised 3 feet above the floor, a physical reminder that the law looked down on everyone equally. There was no jury box. Territorial law allowed judges to decide civil cases alone, which meant everything depended on one man. Judge Isaac Williams, 62 years old and known for following the letter of the law with the precision of a watchmaker. The spectator benches were packed. 60 people crammed into a space meant for 40, half of them, drawn by genuine concern, half by the entertainment value of watching a powerful man try to destroy someone weaker. That was how it worked out here. Every trial was theater, every verdict a story people would tell for years. Ethan sat at the defendant's table beside Naira and Hiram Goldman. His suit was the same one he'd worn for the wedding, already starting to feel worn. Naira wore her blue cotton dress, her hair braided simply, her hands folded in her lap to hide the trembling. Across the aisle, Edwin Bennett sat flanked by 2 lawyers from Kansas City. James Crawford was the lead, 55 years old, expensive suit, silver hair, the kind of lawyer rich men hired when they wanted to crush someone completely. He had papers spread in front of him, organized into neat stacks, each one a weapon waiting to be deployed. Behind Bennett sat his 4 hired guns, dressed in their best clothes, but still looking like exactly what they were. Men who solved problems with violence when money couldn't do it alone. Sheriff Dalton stood by the door, his hand resting on his gun belt, watching everything with tired eyes. Judge Williams entered through a side door at exactly 9 o'clock. He was tall and thin, with white hair and a beard trimmed close to his jaw. His black robe swished as he walked, the sound filling the silent courtroom like the rustling of crow wings. He sat arranged his papers, picked up his gavel. Court is now in session. The matter before us is Bennett versus Mercer. Mr. Crawford, you may present your opening statement. Crawford stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the court with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never lost an argument in his life. Your Honor, this is a simple case disguised as a complicated one. Edwin Bennett is a concerned father looking for his missing daughter. Clara Bennett, age 22, disappeared after arranging to travel to New Mexico as a mail-order bride. The last person seen with her was the defendant, Naira Redhawk. He gestured toward Naira without looking at her, as if she was evidence, not a person. Miss Redhawk arrived at the Mercer Ranch claiming to be Miss Bennett. She then entered into a hasty marriage with Mr. Mercer, clearly designed to shield herself from legal consequences. We will prove that Miss Redhawk conspired to kidnap Clara Bennett, that she is withholding information about Miss Bennett's whereabouts, and that this marriage is a fraud designed to obstruct justice. He sat down satisfied. Goldman stood. He didn't button his jacket or arrange his papers. He just looked at the judge with the directness of someone who believed truth was stronger than performance. Your Honor, this is not a kidnapping case. This is a rescue case. Clara Bennett fled from an abusive father. My client helped her escape. That's not a crime. That's an act of courage. We will prove that Edwin Bennett has a history of violence against his daughter. We will prove that the marriage between Ethan and Naira Mercer is genuine and legal. And if we're very lucky, we will prove that Clara Bennett is alive, safe, and free from the man who terrorized her for years. Judge Williams wrote something in his ledger. Mr. Crawford, call your first witness. Crawford stood again. The plaintiff calls Edwin Bennett. Bennett walked to the witness stand like he owned it. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat with the posture of a man used to being believed. Crawford led him through the story, how Clara had been a dutiful daughter, how she'd seemed happy, how she'd expressed interest in finding a husband through the bride agency, how Bennett had supported her decision only to have her disappear. And when did you last see your daughter? Crawford asked. 3 months ago, in Kansas. She kissed me goodbye and said she was traveling to New Mexico to meet her intended husband. And you haven't heard from her since? Not a word. I've been frantic with worry. It was a good performance. Bennett's voice carried just the right mix of concern and grief. If you didn't know better, you'd believe every word. Goldman stood for cross-examination. Mr. Bennett, you say your daughter was happy, yet she traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. Does that seem like the action of a happy person? Lots of women marry through agencies. It's not unusual. Did Clara have friends in Kansas? Of course. Name one. Bennett hesitated just a fraction of a second. She was a private person. Did she attend social functions, dances, church gatherings? She preferred to stay home. Or was she kept home? Objection, Crawford said. Speculation. Sustained, Williams said. Goldman changed direction. Mr. Bennett, do you have a temper? No more than any man. Have you ever struck your daughter? Bennett's jaw tightened. I disciplined her when necessary, as any father would. Disciplined. Interesting word. Did this discipline leave marks? I don't recall. Goldman pulled a paper from his file. I have a sworn statement from Mrs. Catherine Patterson of Stillwater, New Mexico. She states that she saw Clara Bennett 8 months ago with bruises on her wrists. When asked about them, Clara claimed she'd fallen from a horse. Mrs. Patterson states, and I quote, I know the difference between horse bruises and hand bruises. Those were hand bruises. Crawford was on his feet. Hearsay, Your Honor. This witness isn't even present. She's outside, Your Honor, Goldman said, ready to testify if needed. Williams considered. I'll allow the statement into evidence. Continue, Mr. Goldman. Goldman turned back to Bennett. Did you grab your daughter hard enough to bruise her wrists? She was disobedient. Sometimes correction is necessary. Correction, another interesting word. Most fathers don't leave bruises when correcting their daughters. Bennett's facade cracked slightly, anger showing through. You don't know what it's like raising a daughter alone after her mother dies. Clara was difficult. Willful. She needed a firm hand. Or she needed to escape. No further questions. The morning wore on. Crawford called witnesses. The proprietor of the boarding house in Santa Fe testified that he'd seen Naira and Clara talking. A stage driver testified that Naira had traveled to Mercer's ranch around the time Clara was supposed to arrive. Everything circumstantial. Nothing proved kidnapping. But it built a picture, a narrative of suspicion. Goldman countered with Mrs. Patterson, who testified in person about the bruises, her voice shaking but determined. He called Reverend Hayes, who testified that the marriage ceremony had been legitimate, that both parties had consented freely. By noon, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, everyone sweating in the September heat, the air thick with tension, and the smell of too many bodies packed too close. Williams called a 30-minute recess. In the small room behind the courthouse, Ethan and Naira sat with Goldman. "How are we doing?" Ethan asked. "Badly. Without Clara, it's your word against Bennett's money. Williams is fair, but he's also practical. He won't void a legal marriage without strong cause, but he also won't ignore evidence of possible kidnapping. So what do we do?" Goldman was about to answer when the door burst open. Sheriff Dalton stood there breathing hard. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." He stepped aside. Through the door came a young woman, blonde hair cut shorter than it had been in any description, wearing a simple gray dress and carrying herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make herself small. Clara Bennett, and beside her a man in a blue uniform with a silver star pinned to his chest. U.S. Marshal Jack Morrison, 40 years old, hard-eyed, carrying papers in a leather folder. Naira stood up so fast her chair fell over. "Clara." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She crossed the room in 3 steps and threw her arms around Naira. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. I was scared, but when I got your telegram, I knew I had to." Goldman was already on his feet. "Marshal Morrison, your presence here is most fortuitous." Morrison nodded. "I've been investigating Edwin Bennett for 9 months. Allegations of fraud, assault, and corruption. When Miss Bennett here contacted me from San Francisco, I knew I had to bring her back to testify." "It's Mrs. Dawson now," Clara said quietly. "I'm married, a good man who doesn't hurt me." Goldman smiled, the first genuine smile Ethan had seen on the lawyer's face. "Well then, I think we should return to court." The courtroom went silent when Clara walked in. Bennett's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Shock, relief, fear, anger. He half stood from his chair, then sat back down when Morrison's hand moved toward his gun. Judge Williams looked from Clara to Bennett and back again. "Miss Bennett, or Mrs. Dawson, I understand. This is unexpected." "I apologize, Your Honor, but I had to come. I couldn't let an innocent woman be punished for helping me." "You'll have your chance to testify. Please sit." Morrison escorted Clara to a chair beside the witness stand. Bennett stared at her like she was a ghost, his carefully constructed story falling apart with every breath she took. Goldman stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Clara Dawson to the stand." Clara took the oath, sat down, folded her hands in her lap. Goldman approached gently. "Mrs. Dawson, why did you leave Kansas?" Clara's voice was quiet but steady. "Because my father was going to kill me eventually. Maybe not on purpose, but one day his temper would go too far and I'd be dead. Like my mother." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Williams gavelled for silence. "Explain what you mean," Goldman said. Clara took a breath. "My father has beaten me for 10 years, since I was 12. At first it was slaps, then closed fists, then worse. My mother tried to protect me. She died when I was 16. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I saw the bruises on her ribs. I think he broke something inside her and she was too scared to tell anyone." Bennett stood up. "This is lies. She's been poisoned by these people turned against me." "Mr. Bennett, sit down or I'll have you removed," Williams said sharply. Bennett sat, his face purple with rage. Goldman continued. "Do you have evidence of these beatings?" Clara stood up, unbuttoned her sleeve, rolled it up. Her forearm was covered in small scars, some old, some more recent. Then she pulled down the collar of her dress, showing a long scar across her collarbone. This one was from when I was 17. I disagreed with my father about a business decision. He threw a glass at me. It shattered on my chest. I still have pieces of glass working their way out sometimes. She pulled papers from her bag. When I reached San Francisco, I went to a doctor. He documented everything, photographed my injuries, wrote a medical report. Goldman took the papers, showed them to Williams, then to the court. Daguerreotyped photographs showing scars, bruises in various stages of healing. A medical report detailing 7 major injuries and dozens of minor ones. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. "Why didn't you tell anyone in Kansas?" Goldman asked. "Who would I tell? My father owns half the town. The sheriff is his friend. The judge plays cards with him every Thursday. I was trapped." "So you arranged to leave through the bride agency?" "Yes, but when the time came, I was too scared. I thought my father would find me at the Mercer Ranch, so I asked Naira to go in my place to make him think I was there while I disappeared to California." "Did Naira kidnap you?" "No, she saved my life." Goldman let that sit for a moment. No further questions. Crawford stood for cross-examination, but his heart wasn't in it. What could he say? The evidence was there. The scars were real. The photographs didn't lie. "Mrs. Dawson, isn't it true that you're saying all this because you want to escape your responsibilities to your father?" "My only responsibility was to survive. I've done that." Crawford sat down defeated. Williams looked at Marshal Morrison. "Marshal, you said you have been investigating Mr. Bennett." Morrison stood, opened his folder. "Yes, Your Honor. For 9 months. I have evidence of land fraud, forged titles, bribes paid to local officials, and statements from 3 other witnesses in Kansas who saw Bennett assault his daughter, but were too frightened to come forward." He laid papers on the bench. "I also have a warrant for Edwin Bennett's arrest on charges of fraud and assault." Bennett stood again, but this time Dalton was ready. He moved behind Bennett, hand on his gun. "Edwin Bennett," Morrison said, "you're under arrest. This is outrageous. I'm the victim here. You're a criminal, and you're going to jail." Dalton put Bennett in handcuffs as the courtroom watched. Bennett struggled, shouted, threatened lawsuits and retribution. Nobody listened. Williams gavelled for order. "I've heard enough. This court finds no evidence of kidnapping. The marriage between Ethan Mercer and Naira Mercer is legal and valid. All charges against Mrs. Mercer are dismissed. Furthermore, Mr. Bennett is ordered to pay $500 to the Mercers for legal fees and damages." He brought the gavel down with finality. "This court is adjourned." Ethan and Naira stood in the sudden chaos of the courtroom, people talking and moving, and Bennett being dragged out, still shouting. Clara came to them, wrapped her arms around Naira again. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Your family," Naira said. "Family doesn't give up." Outside, as the afternoon sun beat down on Stillwater's dusty street, Ethan shook Goldman's hand. "You saved us." "Clara saved you. I just presented the evidence." "Still, thank you." Goldman smiled. "Go home, Mr. Mercer. Build your life and try to stay out of courtrooms." Back at the ranch, life settled into something that felt almost like normal. Almost. The north pasture was gone, sold to Patterson, a constant reminder of what the fight had cost. But the ranch itself survived. The corn and beans and squash Naira had planted grew in neat rows, the 3 sisters doing their ancient work of feeding people who knew how to listen to the land. Ethan fixed the bridge across Crossing Creek, replaced the rotted planks with new oak, reinforced the support beams with stone pillars he quarried from the hillside himself. It took him 3 weeks of hard work. But when it was done, the bridge was strong enough to last another 100 years. Naira crossed it every day, facing her fear one step at a time, until the day came when she could walk across without her heart racing, without seeing her mother's hand slipping from hers in floodwater. Sam visited often, usually with Mrs. Patterson, the 2 of them courting in the slow, careful way of people who'd both been hurt before and weren't in a rush to be hurt again. Clara came back twice that first year, traveling from San Francisco with her husband Robert, an engineer who spoke softly and never raised his hand in anger. The second time, Clara was 4 months pregnant, glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from being free and loved and safe. And then one November night, when the first snow was starting to dust the high peaks, Naira told Ethan she was pregnant too. They were sitting on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. She took his hand, placed it on her belly, where nothing showed yet, but everything was changing. "We're going to have a baby," she said. Ethan's breath stopped. For a moment, he was back in that other time 3 years ago, holding Sarah while she died, holding a baby who never got the chance to live. "Ethan," Naira said softly, reading his fear. "I'm not Sarah. This isn't then. We're here now, and we're going to be fine. You can't know that." "No, but I can believe it, and you can believe it with me." He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and let himself hope, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, the universe wasn't done taking things from him. The baby came in late spring during a night when the world seemed determined to test every promise they'd made. Naira's labor started at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Ethan woke to find her gripping the bedpost, breathing hard through a contraction. "Get Sam," she said. "He needs to ride for the doctor." Ethan ran. Sam was asleep in his small cabin, 100 yards from the main house built, so he could help with the ranch and court Mrs. Patterson in equal measure. Ethan pounded on the door until Sam appeared half-dressed and confused. "The baby's coming. Ride for Stillwater. Get Dr. Harrison." Sam was on his horse and gone in 5 minutes, riding hard into the darkness, a lantern swinging from a saddle. Ethan went back to Naira. She'd moved to the bed, her face pale, sweat already beading on her forehead. "It's too fast," she said. "Something's wrong." "Sam will bring the doctor. It'll be fine." But hours passed and Sam didn't return. Dawn came. The labor intensified. Naira's pain grew beyond anything Ethan knew how to help with. And then at 7 in the morning, they heard a horse. Ethan ran to the door, expecting to see Sam with the doctor. Instead, he saw Sam alone, blood soaking through his shirt, barely staying in the saddle. Sam fell more than dismounted, landing hard in the dirt. Ethan caught him before his head hit the ground. "What happened?" "Bennett's men," Sam gasped. "Two of them. Waiting on the road. They wanted revenge. Shot me. I got one. The other ran." Blood pumped from a wound in Sam's shoulder, bright red and dangerous. From inside the house, Naira screamed. Ethan looked from Sam to the house and back, his mind fragmenting with impossible choices. "Go," Sam said. "Help your wife. I'll be fine." "You're bleeding out." "Then I'll bleed. But if you don't help her now, you might lose both of them." Naira's voice came through the door. "Then I need you." He made the decision in a heartbeat. "Naira, can you help Sam?" "I can't move. The baby's coming right now." Ethan looked at Sam, at this man who'd become more than a friend, who'd saved him and supported him, and now lay bleeding in the dirt. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Don't be sorry. Be a father. I've lived long enough." Ethan ran inside, found Naira on the bed, her water broken, the baby crowning. "I'll do this," he said. "I delivered calves. I can deliver our baby." "It's not the same." "It'll have to be." He washed his hands, moved to the end of the bed, talked Naira through pushing when her body told her to push, breathing when it told her to breathe. Outside, he could hear Sam groaning, could hear the wet sound of the old man trying to stop his own bleeding. Inside, Naira was tearing herself apart to bring new life into the world. 10 minutes. 20. Time stopped meaning anything. And then in a rush of blood and fluid and miracle, the baby came. A girl. Dark hair, strong lungs, screaming her arrival like a challenge to the universe. Ethan cut the cord with his knife, wrapped the baby in a clean blanket, placed her on Naira's chest. "We have a daughter," he said, his voice breaking. Naira held the baby, tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, everything that had come before, every loss and scar and mile of running, became worth it. But Sam was still bleeding outside. "I have to help him," Ethan said. "Go. We'll be here." Ethan ran back out. Sam was barely conscious, his makeshift bandage soaked through. Ethan carried him inside, laid him on the kitchen table. Using everything Naira had taught him about healing, everything he'd learned, watching her save Sam once before he dug out the bullet, stitched the wound, packed it with yarrow and sage. Sam's eyes fluttered open. The baby. A girl. Perfect. Sam smiled. "Good. That's good. You tell her Uncle Sam loved her before he ever met her." "You're not dying. I won't let you." "You don't get a vote, son." But Sam was wrong. The bleeding stopped. The fever that came after broke on the third day. He survived, weak and ornery and grateful to be alive. When he was strong enough to sit up, Ethan brought the baby to him. "This is Sarah Rosa," Ethan said. "Sarah for my first daughter and first wife. Rosa for your wife. We figured between them, they'd keep her safe." Sam held the tiny bundle, tears running into his beard. You did good, Ethan. You did real good. 10 years passed like water flowing downstream. Sarah Rosa grew into a girl who could track coyotes and read Latin, who crossed bridges without fear and planted corn with her mother's sure hands. She had Ethan's eyes and Naira's spirit, and every day she proved that sometimes the best things come from the hardest fights. 2 years after Sarah was born, they had a son, Thomas Samuel, named for Naira's Apache grandfather, and Sam Whitfield both. He was quieter than his sister, thoughtful and kind, more interested in books than horses, but loved no less for it. The ranch prospered. They bought back 50 acres of the north pasture from Patterson's widow after he died. It wasn't everything they'd lost, but it was enough. The three sisters' garden expanded to 2 acres. Naira taught medicine to anyone who wanted to learn, passing on her grandmother's knowledge to a new generation. Sam married Mrs. Patterson in a ceremony by the creek, with Sarah Rosa throwing flowers and Thomas Samuel carrying the rings. They had no children of their own, but considered Ethan's kids close enough. Clara visited every summer with her growing family. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and all healthy and loved and free. The bridge across Crossing Creek became known as Red Hawk Bridge, and when the town council erected a sign marking it as a historic landmark, they dated it to 1879 and credited both Ethan and Naira for its construction. It stood strong through floods and droughts, through winters that froze the creek solid and summers that dried it to mud. It outlasted the people who built it, which was the whole point of building anything. And then on a June day in 2023, an old man sat on a porch and told his grandson why some things were worth more than money. Ethan Mercer was 78 years old now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his body marked by decades of hard work. But his mind was sharp and his memory was long, and when Mason asked him why he wouldn't sell the ranch for $4.2 million, Ethan knew exactly what to say. You understand now, Ethan asked as the story wound to its end, why I can't sell. Mason looked at the bridge, at the fields, at the house where 4 generations had lived and loved and struggled. I think so. But Grandpa, you said you lost the north pasture. You sold your best land. Wasn't that a mistake? I sold land. I kept something more valuable. Grandma, not just her. Everything she brought, the knowledge, the courage, the determination to make something beautiful from broken pieces, that's worth more than any acreage. Mason was quiet for a long moment. What happened to Bennett, to Clara? Bennett went to prison. 10 years hard labor. Died of a heart attack in his cell, still swearing revenge. Clara lived to be 87, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She came to visit your grandmother every year until Naira died. They were sisters in every way that mattered. And Sam? Sam lived to 92, ornery to the last. He's buried next to his Rosa up on the hill where the wildflowers grow. Your grandmother picked the spot. Ethan pulled out his father's pocket watch, opened it. Inside now was a different photograph. Ethan and Naira on their wedding day, standing by the creek looking at each other with something that wasn't quite love yet but would become it. This is yours now, Ethan said, handing it to Mason. 4th generation. When you have children, you'll pass it to them, and you'll tell them the story. About the woman who stepped off a carriage and said it wasn't a mistake. About the man who chose to believe her. About what happens when you decide that people matter more than profit. Mason held the watch carefully, feeling the weight of history in his palm. I won't sell, he said. I'll keep the ranch. I'll learn to run it. And when I'm old, I'll sit on this porch and tell my grandkids the same story. Ethan smiled, the deep, satisfied smile of a man who'd done what he set out to do. Then I did my job. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you pass forward. Your grandmother taught me that. Took me a while to learn it, but I got there eventually. They sat together as the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across land that had been fought for and bled on and loved into prosperity. The bridge still stood strong and true. The fields still grew, and the story, the most important part of all, would continue. Inside the house, in a frame on the wall, hung a photograph from 1905. Ethan and Naira, middle-aged and weathered, surrounded by their children and Sam and Mrs. Patterson and Clara's family. 15 people in total, 3 different ethnicities, all of them smiling with the particular joy that comes from surviving things that should have killed you and coming out stronger on the other side. Below the photograph, a small plaque engraved with words Nara had written in her journal, and Ethan had found after she died. We are not defined by what we run from, but by what we choose to build when we finally stop running. This bridge, this land, this family is my answer to everyone who said I didn't belong. I belong here, we all do. Mason read the words again, understanding them in a way he hadn't before. Tell me more, he said, about Grandma, about building the bridge, about all of it. And Ethan did, because that's what stories are for. Not to remember the past, but to light the way forward. Outside Red Hawk Bridge spanned Crossing Creek exactly as it had for 145 years, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes the strongest foundations are built from the weakest moments when people who have nothing left decide to build something anyway. The sun set over New Mexico, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind carried the smell of sage and possibility. And on the porch of Mercer's Crossing Ranch, two generations sat together, connected by blood and story, and the understanding that some things matter more than money ever could. The watch ticked in Mason's hand, keeping perfect time, carrying forward the promise that Ethan's father had made, and Ethan had kept, and Mason would honor. That promises made in the hardest moments are the ones worth keeping. That love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and roses. Sometimes it arrives dusty and uncertain, saying only, "It's not a mistake, I'm yours." And you have to be brave enough to believe it. And that the best legacy you can leave is not measured in acres or dollars, but in the people who come after you and the stories they tell when you're gone.